Okay, just review the Mishnah on Tzadik Chetzim Beis 98b. Ashel as a par v'shalachol biad b'noy biad avdei biad shluchay biad shluchay. So somebody, you have a lender who is lending out his animal to a borrower, and he has to move the animal from the lender's house to the borrower's house. So the first examples are where he sent his own messenger, and they were either his son, his slave, or his agent. Or alternatively, the borrower sent someone to go pick it up. Who did he send? Same people. Biad Menoi, Biad Avdi, Biad Shlucha, son, slave, or agent, Shoshoel. And the lender gave the representative, whether it was his own representative or whether it was the borrower's representative, the animal, and the animal dies, Potter, you're exempt. Okay. Okay, I should point out that I didn't have a chance to point this out yesterday. There are sort of two reasons for this. The simple reason is the simple explanation is that this agent wasn't a technically appointed agent. He was what we call a schira v'lekitai. A schira v'lekitai. It's hard to get a good English word for this. This is like a schlepper, so to speak. It's like an individual, an executive, personal executive assistant. You know, the guy who was always hanging around the CEO. You know, that fellow. So the CEO sent his personal executive assistant to go pick up the animal. So it's sort of implied that he's an agent, because that's basically his job, is to be an agent. Right. And however, he wasn't a technically speaking appointed agent. He wasn't actually appointed. Because he wasn't appointed, none of this is the shlichus on behalf of the lender is not significant, and therefore it remains in the lender's domain until the borrower takes possession, which happens when he gets into his domain. Now, the other option is it could be even a scenario where he appointed him as a shliach, but he didn't specifically tell him to accept the responsibility of being an agent. So the guy is the agent is an appointed agent, but one where he did not accept responsibility for the onus, the possibility of damage along the journey. Now, what happens if he did accept responsibility? That's the second half of the mission. The borrower says, send it with either my son, my slave, or my agent. Or with your son, your slave, your agent. Or the lender notified him he was going to send it with an agent, and the borrower agreed to that stipulation. And that's what happened, and it died suddenly. Chayev, then the borrower is liable because he's accepted the responsibility of the journey. The same is true in the opposite way, giving back the animal. If the mashal, the lender, accepts the responsibility of the journey, then the borrower would be exempt. Otherwise, it's the borrower's culpability up until the point where the animal's in the domain of the lender. Now we're on top of 99a. Okay, 99a, top of the page. Biyad avdei chayev. The Gemara is saying, is that the case? Can you appoint a slave as an agent? The general principle is yad eved ki yad rabbi. Whatever the slave owns, his master owns. So you're sending with a slave, while the slave is the master. How can the slave serve as an agent? So the Gemara says, there's two different answers here. Omar Shmuel proposes, be'eved ivri. It's a Jewish slave. Delekani legufei. And eved ivri is sort of a it's similar to a long-term lease. You don't actually own him. And therefore he doesn't entirely represent you, and he can serve as an agent on behalf of the borrower. The lender's eved ivri serves as the agent of the borrower, simply because the Eved Ivri is not entirely owned by the lender. Rav explains, I feel time of Eved Kanani, even in a scenario of Eved Kanani. One second. Again, I feel time of Eved Kanani. It's even if you'll say that the scenario is referring to an Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish slave, it's no different than the following scenario where the lender, let's say, is on one side of the field, and the borrower is on the other side of the field, and the borrower hollers to the lender to hit the animal so it should run across the field, and he'll pick it up. And the lender agrees. So the lender gives the animal a hit, and it runs across the field, and the borrower gets it. The law is that because this was done at the stipulation, the lender did this at the stipulation of the borrower. Therefore, the borrower is responsible from the moment the animal is hit. So a slave is no worse than hitting an animal. So if you agree to that type of stipulation, then why not? So Yad Eved Yad Rabbi, it doesn't make a difference. In other words, it doesn't require that there's no need here for an actual kinyan, which the slave could not do. What is required is that the borrower stipulate when he's accepting responsibility, and the lender go through with that agreement, and that can be done through a slave.
Slave couldn't have a kinyan even like he's for his master.
So for his master, could. That's the problem. He would only be able to acquire for his master, not for the borrower. Okay. Meitzvei, question. A guy sends the borrowed animal with his son or with an agent. Chayev, then the borrower is liable. Presumably, this is where the borrower specified it should be done that way. However, biad avdei, if he sends it through a slave, then potter, the borrower is exempt. This is not like our mission, by the way, obviously, right? Our mission does not make that distinction. This brisa does. Well, why? What's the difference? Why does our mission not make the distinction? Why does the brisa make the distinction that a slave is different? Even though on your agent and your son you'd be liable from the moment that they get it, but your slave, but the guy's slave, you wouldn't be. Why is that? According to Shmuel, I can understand very simple. The mission is referring to a Jewish slave. The brisa is Be'evet Kanani, a non-Jewish slave. So that makes sense. A non-Jewish slave is different categories. So then you can, because it's a non-Jewish slave, therefore the borrower does not acquire the slave, and therefore he isn't liable. I'm sorry, he doesn't acquire the animal because the slave still owns it, and he doesn't acquire the animal, so then therefore he's not liable for the damages of shayla, of borrowing. El Rav, but according to Rav Kasha, what's the difference? One second. Okay. So the Gemara says you have to amend the statement of Rav. Rav says that when you sent the slave, it doesn't actually mean that you sent the slave. What happened was the borrower told the lender to hit the animal and it should come. And the lender listened, but he sent the slave afterwards to make sure, double check. And if he sees any issues, then the slave should stop the animal.
A slave.
And a Kanani slave. Well, according to Rav, it doesn't make a difference.
Oh, it doesn't make
I shouldn't say it doesn't make a difference. According to Rav, we're not referring to an every slave. So it does make a difference, but we're not referring to it. So he sends his Kanani slaves sort of just to keep an eye out. So actually, this is exactly the same as hitting the animal and telling it to come by hitting it, and therefore the borrower is liable because he instructed the lender to bring him the animal in that manner. The fact that a slave was sent to accompany the animal, it doesn't make a difference. The Itmar we learned Hashilani Paroska. A guy says to his friend, let me borrow your ox. He says, how should I send it? He says to him, hit it and it will come to me. Omer of Nachman, Omer Rav, even Shiotza Mishus Mashal Umesa Chayev. Once it leaves the domain, the courtyard of the lender, then it's following the instructions of the borrower. It becomes the borrower's, and he's liable. Okay, so where's his name of Messiah? Let's say we have a Bryce to support Rav. Hashilani Parotzav Amar Biadmi. And see, he says the lender says, "How should I send it to you?" So the borrower says, he says, "Hit it, and it will come to me." As soon as it leaves the domain of the lender, then the borrower is liable. So this seems to support the opinion of Rav, right? Except that it's not necessarily. Why? Rashi says, what are we referring to? What happened was, you draw a box, right? The outer box, it was like what's that country in Lesotho? Lesotho. That country in South Africa. The only way to get to it is by going through South Africa. There's no other way to get to it. So the same story. The guy's property is surrounded on all sides, or at least whatever. The only way to get to it is from the lender's property. And the moment it leaves the lender's property, it's going to go into the borrower's property. Correct. On the interior side of the courtyard of the lender. When he sends the animal, for sure it's going to go into the domain of the borrower. Samara says, well, obviously that's the case. There's only one place for it to go. Samara says, not quite. So the lender's property has these corners and these sheds where the animal, even if you hit the animal, it could sort of run to a shed. So maybe it will never make it there. It will just still hang out at the lender's property. So the Gemara says, the guy's not sure, Dilma Kaima Hosav Leas. Maybe it will hang around in the corners and it won't come. It won't come to him. No, he's pretty confident if you hit the animal, it's going to come into his property. And because it comes directly, so therefore he actually does acquire it. So it does not prove the general question of whether or not Hikisha Makalvi Tava is the method of the shell acquiring. That remains unresolved. Rav says it works, but it isn't necessarily the case that anyone agrees with him. As Rav says that if the borrower tells the lender, hit the animal and tell it to come to me, then I acquire it. I have liability from the moment it leaves the domain of the lender. But it isn't clear that everyone agrees to him. What about the Bryce? Bryce is not approved because the Bryce is this scenario where the courtyards are side by side. So necessarily when it leaves one, it enters the other. Okay. Omer Rav Huna has an interesting idea. If a guy borrows an axe from his friend, so if he used the axe to split the wood, he acquires it. But if he doesn't use it to cut wood, to split wood, then he does not acquire it. So this is pretty interesting, right? You borrow something, you actually have to use it to be liable. Yeah. We never saw that.
No.
To the contrary, if anything, the past Gemara has told us, if anything, you don't need to use it. Okay, so we'll get to it. See, where is Lamai? What is it? What do you mean, kanai? You acquire. What exactly do you acquire for? For what purposes? Ilam la'insin. Maybe it means for liability. Someone says that doesn't make sense because ma'ishna par de mishasha elo. Why is it that by an ox it's from the time of the loan? In other words, by the ox we say that for the time of the loan you're liable, even if you didn't use the ox. But when it comes to an axe, we say that actually have to use the axe. Why would that be a difference? So the says el chazor. It means to change your mind. Okay, so as follows. If you use the axe, then the lender cannot change his mind. He must go through with the loan. If, however, he did not use the axe, then the lender is not obligated to the loan, and he can change his mind and withdraw the privilege of the loan. And he can collect it. He says, I want my axe back, and you have to give it back. Okay. This must disagree with the opinion of Rav Ami. So just explain this before we see it inside. I'm sure we're real familiar now with the laws of Me'ila Behektish. Being Me'il Behektish is the inappropriate use of Hektish funds or Hektish items. some of those items might actually belong to the temple, the actual temple. Things like a knife for slaughtering, right? These are actual useful items for the temple. Some things might be for the temple property. You know, they have maybe they have a temple business, like they rent out axes or something. Basic idea here is that if a guy takes an axe of hektish, now remember, an axe of hektish actually is sort of consecrated because they need the axes to fell the trees to be able to feed the fires. So they actually had a collection of axes to knock down trees so they can have wood. So he takes an axe from hektish. Immediately from when he takes it, he inappropriately uses hektish, and he gets a penalty for that. Moreover, because he's paying that penalty, the value of time that he has it is already his, and therefore, if his friend uses the axe, his friend actually is exempt because he's already stolen that value, even though he's going to give back the axe as is, and presumably it's an axe. You can imagine that depreciation is fairly minimal, right? An axe is not quite the depreciating instrument or tool. But because that time value is already taken, so well as his friend can use it because it's chula now. It's not sanctified. Now, hold on a second. According to Rav Ami, we just According to Rav Huna, we just explained that you can change your mind up until the fact that you use the axe. Then why are you mile behektish? You shouldn't be mile behektish. You can't be inappropriately using it if actually nothing really happened, because hektish can demand it back, and if hektish was a borrower, was a lender, you would be obligated as a borrower to return it. That's the question, and the answer, whatever. Clearly, Rav Huna disagrees with this statement of Rav Ami. So what does Rav Ami say again? Well, please, Rav Ami. He disagrees with Rav Ami. The Rav Ami, Hamashal Kardon Shal Hektish, a guy borrows a axe of hektish. He is moil, he inappropriately used hektish to toivas and all, meaning the ability to use it for the amount of time that he has it. And moreover, because that use is already paid for, his friend is allowed to use the hektish axe, even though it's going to go back to hektish.
It's paid for.
Meaning, when a guy steals a hektish axe, but inappropriately takes a hektish axe, so he gets a penalty for the amount of time that he's taken it.
Oh, okay.
Because the axe itself is going to go back. He's going to give hektish back the axe. So he pays it, let's say that, there's a rent-a-center. He pays it the rent-a-center rental price for the axe. So once he's paid that price, then his friend can use it, because the time value of it has already been paid for. So it's unsanctified now. Even though it's interesting, because even though the axe itself is sanctified, right? But the time value of the axe, because this is not a depreciating asset, the time value of the axe, the rental, because he didn't say the hektish is allowed to rent you an axe.
Right.
They can have a rental business, and they're not using it, and that rental value has been paid for, so therefore it's chulin, and the guy's allowed to use it l'chatchila. Okay, 1 second. Okay, hold on a second. But if with regard to a loan, the borrower has not acquired it, am I mal? But my chaver if according to Rav Huna, then there should be no me'ila here because you never used it, and you can always demand it back, and no use has been done, and your friend shouldn't be allowed to use it either. So clearly they disagree. Moreover, Rav Huna also disagrees with Rav Elazar. Plead Rav Elazar. Rav Elazar, K'derash Tiknu Meshicha B'Lekuchas, Tach Tiknu Meshicha B'Shemer. Rav Elazar says, just like to acquire I want to buy barley from the store, I have to lift up the barley or pull it. If it's a lot of barley on a pallet, I can pull it. Similarly, for a shomer, for a watchman, in order for him to acquire liability, all he needs to do is to pull it. And pulling it alone acquires it even without using it. Similarly, once you collect your axe, then you're liable, and the guy can't change his mind. It's the same set of rules. We learned as well in a brayse. Just like Mashiach works to buy something, Mashiach works for the obligations and responsibilities and privileges that a shomer has, a watchman has, depending on the different type of watchman or whether he was a borrower or a lender. Okay. And similarly, how do you acquire property? So we saw just a half a year ago in Masechtas Kedushin, there were three ways to acquire property: kesef, money; shtar, a document; or chazaka, actually using the land. Now, this would, changing the locks would also be sufficient. So kach schiras nikne bekesef ubeshtar ubechazaka. So a rental is the same story. One second. Kach schiras nikne bekesef ubeshtar ubechazaka. One second. Okay, yeah. Similarly, a rental is acquired with kesef, with money, with a shtar, with a document, or with chazaka, with using it. Somewhere says schiras mayavidte. How exactly are you acquiring schiras with chazaka? Typically, a rental item is typically acquired with mashicha, with pulling it, not with chazaka, with using it. Well, effectively, it'd be the same thing. You acquire it with mashicha. And anyway, the Mishnah just said that schiras has the same set of laws as the mashicha. So Amar Chizah explains, no, we don't mean renting an animal. Schiras karka, we mean renting property. So meaning, just like you buy a house, how do you buy a house? Document, money, or using it. Similarly, if you rent a house, same story. Okay, Amar Shmuel. Haman the Gozel Chavitza the Tamrei Mechaveroi. V'isba Chamishim Tamrei. Okay, it's an interesting story here, and it's actually quite an interesting Gemara because it pertains to a lot of things we have today. Obviously in my work in Katras, you see how many companies profit just off the difference between bulk and small and retail size. It's a very the profit margin difference here is huge. It's a huge amount of cake to bite into, so to speak. And there are companies' entire business is just biting into that's those slices there. They buy rail cars and they sell them in cups. Literally. Okay, so this is the story basically. So he steals chavitza the tamrei. Chavitza tamrei is a ring of dates. There are 50 rings on the date, 50 dates on the ring, like a necklace type of thing. Ve'ez b'chamishim tamrei. It has 50 dates. Agav hadadim is daven benun. If you sell them one at a time, this is not very profitable. then they're one coin for each date. So you get 50 coins. I'm sorry. Agav hadadim is daven benun nechichad. If they're sold as an entire ring, as entire necklace of these dates, then they're sold for 49. Chadachadim is daven benun. If you sell them one at a time, then you pay 50, one for each of them. So the guy is basically a 2% profit margin. Okay. 1 second. Okay, now he steals this ring full of dates. If he steals it from a hedyot, from a regular person, he pays 49. If he steals it from hektish, for hektish he has to pay the full 50. V'chomshayo, and the rule of hektish is when you steal it and when you inappropriately use hektish, then you have to add a fifth to it. So you add a fifth of the 50, another 12 and a half. Another 12 and a half, yeah, because the 50th is 25%. A fifth is really 25%. Yeah. Okay, what we call in English 25%. It's an outside fifth. Yeah. Okay, Mashenki b'mazik, by a guy who damages property, he does not pay a fifth. A guy who damages his friend does not add a fifth. Okay. Rabbi Barabaya asks a question to Abayo. Asks a question to Shmuel. Why, to a regular person who when he steals this ring full of dates, why does he pay 49? Namely, why can't the one who was robbed say, my business is to break it down. I would have gotten 50 coins from this. Why are you paying me 49? So Amar Huna brother of Yeshua, so Rav Huna, the son of Yeshua, says, Shaman base sub ois tanan. Okay. Okay, so let's explain this. Let's say you have give an example. You have Reuven. Okay, Reuven has a field full of corn. Okay, and Shimon's animal goes along and ravages Reuven's cornfields. Okay, how much does Shimon have to pay? So what we do is we evaluate the cornfield. How much is the cornfield sold for, and how much is it sold? Would it have been sold for when it was full, and how much is it sold now? Now let's just give some background. That in a cornfield, there isn't the margin of the value of the cornfield really is the crop. It's not like it's not like that it's not like you're going to use this for an investment. It's a cornfield. However, it is less valuable in the context. The corn on the field is less valuable in the context of the value of the cornfield than it is as its own entity, as the corn from the field. You would have gotten more money had you sold the corn from the field than you sell it as a cornfield that is full versus a cornfield that's ravaged. Mm-hmm. But yet the rule is you evaluate it based on the value of a cornfield that was ravaged. The difference between a full cornfield and you can buy and a ravaged one. So similarly, Rav Huna basically is proposing to him, look, at the end of the day, we evaluate this in the context of, well, what would you sell the whole thing for and what is it worth now? Well, now it's only worth 49. Even if you would have sold 50, it doesn't make a difference. Okay. I'm sorry? Yeah. Okay. Remember the Savar Shmuel din hadyet lav kedin gefaya. So we see from here that Shmuel says the rule of a hedyet is not like the rule of hektish. Meaning hektish you pay more. Hektish is getting the 50 coins, and the hedyet, the commoner, all of us, is only getting 49 coins. Clearly, there's a distinction there. Well, is that the case? V'hatnan we learned. Okay. Notal Evan Aikara me hektish. A guy inappropriately uses from hektish a stone or a beam. Loimal. He is not mile. Let's just give a little bit of background here. So, sort of filling in the details from Rashi, which is coming from the Gemara and Chagiga, which we have previously seen. We're talking here about the stone cutter of hektish, or the sawmill guy. So this guy has a right to keep hektish stock, building materials on his property, obviously, because that's his trade, that's his engagement. Or maybe he's the warehouse manager. So he's the fact that these things are on his property, he's entitled to do. There's nothing wrong with that. In order for him to, if me and you went to Hektish's yard and took a beam and brought it to our house, we're about Hektish immediately, because we're not allowed to have the beam of Hektish on our property, except that if you were the warehouse manager, or you were the wood cutter or the stone cutter, you would be allowed to have the beam on your property. So the fact that the beam is on your property, you moved it with the intention of using it, does not constitute Meila b'Hektish, because maybe you had intention to steal it because by mistake, but that you didn't actually steal it. It was allowed to be there. It was in the right corner. Now it's in the left corner. Nobody sees the problem here. There's no problem. Okay, so if you give it to your friend, then then the guy who gives it to his friend is mile. His friend is not mile. That's typically, generally speaking, how Me'ilah works. We'll get to it when we get to Me'ilah. Okay, if you put it into your house, and obviously the type of installation here is not a installation that changes the substance of the item. So you put the beam in as sort of a cross beam over a door, but it wasn't nailed or painted or screwed or anything like that. So there's no shinoi. There was no change to it. So loimol, still no me'ilah, right? Because again, you're entitled to have this thing on your property. Once you live underneath it, you start using the door, and this is sort of holding up the door. Or you live in the house and it's covering you. Once you have enough living worth of pruta, then you're ma'al b'hektish. You misused hektish. So Ravu was saying in the name of Rabbi Yehudah, who said in the name of Shmuel, same person, same Shmuel. What we see from here is this is a famous debate. The squatters, right? Squatter rights. You have the squatters. This guy, he's living in his friend's property without telling his friend about it. By the way, his friend wasn't renting out the property, right? And he says, okay, I don't want to pay you. Does he have to pay or doesn't he have to pay? So the opinion of Shmuel is, you have to pay. And they're explaining that this brisa indicates the same thing. Meaning, because the brisa says that for living in a hektish house, you have to pay, clearly that means that if you live in somebody's house without telling him, you have to pay. Now, before we get to let's interrupt for a moment. Well, what does that tell you? The law of hektish is exactly the same as the law of the commoner, because you're deriving the commoner's law from the law of hektish. So clearly, it's the same thing. So that's the question on Shmuel. But let's go back and let's explain this for another moment here. Let's say you can live in your friend has a shed. It's always empty. Obviously it's a shed. He can't rent it out. You live in the shed. Okay. And let's say the law is that your friend can't charge you rent. Cannot. Therefore, if you sleep under the house of hektish, that would be the same story. Hektish doesn't know that you slept underneath its house. And without there being a specific request for the beanbag, then it's like sleeping in Hektish's shadow. Nobody knows about it. And the fact that we equate the law of the commoner to the law of Hektish clearly contradicts Shmuel, the previous statement of Shmuel. It's Shmuel's own opinion. So what's going on here? So Rav Yechon says very simple. Hadar be Shmuel me'ahi. Shmuel changed his mind. 1 second. Yeah. The derivation of the law of living in your friend's shed without telling him is not able to be learned from the laws of hektish. The fact that you're mile hektish by sleeping underneath a hektish beam that you put in your property. So the Gemara says, yeah, 1 second, you have a contradiction. Why that one? Why not the other one? Maybe why did he change his mind from the laws of from the sleeping under a hektish beam? Maybe he changed his mind from the law of the Chavitza de Tamri, the ring of hektish, the ring of dates, whether it was a hektish or not. What makes you convinced they changed his mind on one over the other? Somebody says, no, that can't be. The reason for this is because this Rava taught us a key to understanding the laws of hektish. That hektish never knows. Hektish's not knowing is like a commoner knowing. Therefore, if you knew your friend was in the shed, you could bill him for rent. And therefore, hektish not knowing you're living underneath is just like you billing your friend for rent. It's not the same thing. So therefore, it makes sense that Shmuel would agree to Rava in that context, and therefore he changed his mind. Previously, he said you could derive the laws of hektish from Hedyot, the laws of Hedyot from hektish in the context of living underneath hektish's beam. Mm-hmm. And now he's changing his mind. He's saying there's no real comparison there because hektish's not knowing is like a person's knowing. So they're really two separate scenarios. Amar Rava says, so the guys were carrying a barrel of wine and they broke it. Now in this town, this is the rule. On the market day, Monday and Thursdays, it sells for 5 coins. But every other day of the week, it sells for 4 coins. Okay, now. So now the workers have to pay him back a barrel of wine. It says Rav as follows: they pay him back on a market day. They can pay him back a barrel of wine. But any other day of the week, they have to pay him 5 coins because they broke it on a market day where he would have gotten 5 coins for it. So therefore, they have to pay him back 5 coins or a barrel on the market day. Okay. And this is only true. This is true if the guy sold out of all his wine. So he can argue, my wine's worth 5 coins. However, let's say he had leftover. If he has leftover wine, so he can say to them, well, the guy who breaks the barrel could tell the seller, look, you didn't sell everything. Who said I took the one that would have been sold? I took the one that wouldn't have been sold. You would have had to sell tomorrow, in which case it would be worth 4. 1 second. Yeah. So he pays it back a barrel of wine. Okay. So he pays back a barrel of wine any day of the week, even if it's worth 4. Okay. And also Rob is pointing out here that in a scenario where you sell it for where you have to pay 5, there's another catch. So typically when you sell a barrel, it requires 2 things. First of all, you have to find the buyer, right? And then the second thing, there's 2 versions of the Gemara, 2 versions in Rashi here. One is that you have to get a special driller to tap the barrel, so you can be able to put in a tap, install a tap. There's a small fee that the driller would charge to make that hole. The second version is that alternatively, you have to hire an advertiser, a guy who would run around yelling that you're selling wine at a discount price. So because the guy broke the barrel, you've saved yourself a small selling expense. So that selling expense is deducted from the 5 points. Okay, great day.
Extra cost. Make it a great day.